Hello everybody, this is Magda Giurcanu from National Louis University, and together with Joe Rice, we are organizing a series of interviews with public officials and community organizers to explore civic initiatives in the Chicago area. We are the Growing Democracy Group, an interdisciplinary effort committed to youth engagement. We hope you enjoy our episodes.
We've invited two distinguished guests from Chicago to sit with us for our first podcast. We have Riyan Jones from Mikva Challenge and Stonor Saunders from Common Cause. So, to start off with, I would just like you to introduce yourselves and kind of provide a little context to your personal background. Riyan, if you'd like to start.
First and foremost, thank you guys for having me on the podcast. Again, my name is Riyan Jones, he, him pronouns. I am one of the program managers at Mikva Challenge for the citywide youth councils. I run the Safety and Justice Council. That is pretty much a cohort of 25 young people who work to implement restorative justice principles, empathy building, relationship building, and also principles of nonviolence within the juvenile justice department, but also talking with different Cook County stakeholders within the public safety and community safety realm.
I'm Stonor Saunders, and I do policy and outreach at Common Cause, Illinois. You asked about how we got to where we were today, and I don't have a linear journey across many sectors in different cities and with different populations. And I think the thing that sort of has stayed constant with me through everything I've done is collaboration and the needing to bring people who are outside a system inside. I think too many of our tables have one kind of place setting. Too many of our work is in silos, and we need to break those down. And so whether I've worked in healthcare or hospital administration or academia or youth development, gang intervention, gun violence prevention, and now in policy, in democracy policy, good government policy, I think all of that is essential to making the world a better place and to really harnessing the power that people have to make the world a better place.
If I may, I want to actually comment on what you said about civic engagement a little bit. So for me, I'm a natural born, like you said, Chicagoan through and through from the south side of Chicago. And as I think about my journey a little bit, I think about how, for me, civic engagement translates to like the same way they talk about gun violence being a public health crisis. So like for me, civic engagement became like dire, especially when it came to my health. And we could talk about that a little bit more, but specifically like my community, my family, specifically were impacted by, police involved shootings, gun violence, gang violence. And I always tell the story of how I think about one of my best friends. He comes from the same community. He went to another high school out south called Corliss and Simeon, those types of schools and things like that. And I had the privilege of going to, Gwendolyn Brooks as a young person. So like those decisions that my community just invested in me in that sort of way, and how they didn't invest in, others and things like that. How those decisions ultimately changed his trajectory to the point where he's like paralyzed and handicapped from a gun violence incident, and how I'm able to just sit here and have this conversation with you guys. And that's what like draws me, like I said, back to the civic engagement, because again, it's impacted me on such a deep level to the point where like the vicarious trauma that I lived through is just like to the point where I can't resist not saying anything.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. That's quite powerful.
No worries.
So yeah, we always have a personal story right behind us that's moving us forward. And building on that then, and thinking that our listeners are very young, what type of advice would you have for them to just get engaged in terms of thinking about having their voices heard out there, based on your personal experiences again? Like what worked for you as individuals as you were trying to figure out the way of moving forward into a life where perhaps you feel like your voice is not heard enough?
First thing that came to mind was, like I said already, was just somebody invested in me, having that trusted adult. And for me, that came in the form of many different adults, and not even maybe emerging adults. I remember, I don't know why, but maybe it's just a certain light that I walk in or something like that. But I remember, I guess we would call them quote unquote gangbangers, always walking up to me saying like, yeah, you go to that good school, we want you to represent us, you know what I'm saying, as a lawyer, when you come out, and those types of things. And so for me, it's always been my community, but on top of that, I always draw back to my family, just deeply invested in like Afro diasporic things, African culture, African roots, and like things of traditions of family, and how we ground ourselves in like nonviolence and restorative justice, and much storytelling and circle keeping. My grandmother, she was a CPS teacher for X amount of years, but I remember growing up, her taking me to class and things like that, her third grade students at Bishop Elementary, going to her class, talking to them about, like I said, civic engagement, or just being involved in like Black Panther conversations that my grandmother immersed me in. Also, like I said, from Malcolm X to, like I said, Martin Luther King, just all of it. Frederick Douglass is really comes to mind for me, but for me, authenticity would be my main like secret sauce when it comes to working with young people. When you show up authentic, real, 100 for lack of a better phrase, that's what's gonna resonate with them. Because like I feel like we say this all the time, but like young people can smell BS from a mile away. So if you are like fabricating your sauce or like trying to use somebody else's sauce, that's what they notice. So my main thing is I try to show up authentic. I try to show up as a natural Chicagoan. And one thing that stuck with me at the Build restorative justice conversation was this principle Ubuntu, UBUNTU. And it means I am because we are. So for me, it's like that interdependency, that codependency, that I see you, you see me, and therefore we're all interconnected. So that authenticity is my main sauce, I guess, to round up that conversation.
I love that you said authenticity, because I was thinking the same thing, even though my journey is so different, is that authenticness. Right now, for peace, love, and happiness, I'm from New York City, and you and I get along just fine. Right? And kind of like in contrast to you, right, besides our race or gender, all that stuff, is that I grew up where I kind of can go everywhere, but I have a passport to a lot of places, but I don't have one home. My father was an immigrant who spoke 5 different languages. English wasn't his first. He came over as a young adult. My mother was from an old American family that had been here forever. I grew up in New York City and spent 3 or 4 months a year in a town of 700 people, like where the Tea Party was formed, right? So, yeah. And so that sort of theme has always been with me. What it meant is that whether I'm talking to the president of a company or somebody I see on the street, it's approaching people with the authenticity of who you are and feeling comfortable enough. And I think when I think about approach, and I've got a master's degree, Phi Beta Kappa, outcomes effectiveness, all that stuff, but I will be really passionate about the value of lived experience and how important it is for the conversation. When I think about equity, I think about not just only trusting empirical data that we can contain and measure, but also what we know from the ground, what the roots are and the boots are. And one of the things that I think is really beautiful right now is seeing that spaces opening up more for those kinds of conversation, and to take not just the authenticity of those experiences and insights, but to value them and have that inform not just who we are as people, but the work that we're doing with people.
I think you both have high quality, authentic sauce. But more so, you're both very inspiring representatives of your organizations. Could you both speak more to where you are currently, your position, and then some of the history behind Mikva and Common Cause, mission, vision, core values, that sort of thing?
Well, I can start how pretty much I got introduced to Mikva, and I got introduced to Mikva by way of my AP Government and Politics teacher back at Gwendolyn Brooks. And I'm not gonna lie to y'all, I hated that class, and I was disengaged. Like I was a rough student back in high school. So like, even one thing I always say is like I try to be the young person that I needed, the young person nowadays. So like, with that being said, the first thing that I heard about Mikva Challenge was their student election judge program, and that was through some of my peers that were a part of it, and it was pretty much what it sounded like to me was an easy work day. You got to work at an election poll, pretty much take the IDs, and that was your first introduction into the civic engagement process as a young person. But it was a full day, and you got out of school, and that sounded sweet enough to me. Now, I wasn't in that program, but that was my first introduction. I had always had aspirations of like working in laws and criminal justice and all of that sort of stuff, but I actually got this job, this position specifically from, like I said, just being authentic and showing up real. One of my fraternity brothers, you mentioned your fraternity and sororities and things like that. I'm a member of Omega Psi Phi fraternity, and one of my brothers, he actually has been working for Mikva Challenge for a few years now, and he actually, floated my name because of all work that I did at the Chicago Park District through young people. I would say that I needed Mikva Challenge as a young person, because again, if I had the outlet to be able to assert my voice as a young person, starting from our classroom, and that's pretty much one of Mikva's main marquee programs. We actually teach teachers how to implement student voice into their classrooms, and that includes like things like, let's say, school discipline policy, which is where we pretty much have a large hand right now. School policy and whole school safety is really some of our main projects in Mikva land, as I call it. We have a whole nother council called the CPS Student Advisory Council, and they pretty much work directly with CPS to talk about school discipline policies, school resources, school allocation funds, but right now, like school ratings and how they basically categorize young people, and how it calls for like different disinvestments in certain schools, but also investments in others, and how it kind of leaves other students behind. So Mikva has plenty of programs. That's just one. Like I said, teaching teachers how to just deconstruct a lot of the adultist mindset that we have as far as our classroom, and implementing, like I said, more student voice into their classrooms. We have the Citywide Youth Council program, which is my program, where, like I said, we have those deep impacts on the community level and things like that. We also have different community-based programs that focus on our, like, I would say, our marginalized populations on the west side, so Gage Park, North Lawndale, and the New City Back of the Yards communities. And then also we have like nationwide programs called like Soapbox, where we pretty much have different satellite programs where we go to different schools, and different teachers refer young people as young as 6 years old. I've heard soapbox speeches from 6-year-olds about recycling, for instance, and climate change and things like that. But it really gives them that first imprint of utilizing their voice and standing up for something that they believe in. And that's truly the empowering part of it, which is our main mission statement, is we empower them to get civic action about them and things like that. So democracy is a verb. We always coach them to actively participate. You can't be a bystander in democracy. And that's really what I always try to teach my young people. Like, stand up for what you believe in, whether that means you're shaking the table or you're sitting at the table listening. We just all need to be a part of that table.
I've known about the program for a long time, and just love how they don't just engage the kids who are like the student council president. You really do some great community work. And my son was the youth council for a couple of years, got him through the pandemic, and some really great experience. And I think, kind of like Mikva started democracy as a verb, Common Cause started in the wake of huge scandal in American government and democracy, which was the Pentagon Papers around the Vietnam War, and then the Watergate scandal. And it was actually founded as a nonpartisan. And you've got a nonpartisan, bipartisan, right? Our policies that we focus on are nonpartisan. But in the beginning, it was bipartisan, in that a Republican congressman founded and said, look at all of this corruption. There's nobody here representing the people. There's all these people here representing interests. Who's representing the people? Common Cause is the people's lobby. And that's the genesis of it. And if you think about the audacity of this idea, like, oh, okay, so two guys are gonna, have a people's lobby to sort of effectively challenge all of the moneyed special interests, right? That is pretty audacious, but they started and it grew. And so today, from its origins just in DC, we now are in about 28 states, it might be 30, 28 states, and the national headquarters in DC. We do a range of things, everything from sort of challenging policies that we think are unjust or unconstitutional, that have huge implications for democracy, and take that to the Supreme Court. We recently won a really good one about the independent state legislature. Doesn't sound so, sexy, but it would have made the attempts to overturn the election last time successful. So it was really, really important that we won that. But in each state, it's going to be different, because in each state is different, not just because of the community and the culture and the people, but the democratic infrastructure, right? Because we have very, very, very local. So what happens in Chicago or Illinois does not same thing as what's happening in Texas, right? Now there's some similarities, but so it's this idea to have this sort of national infrastructure with some expertise, and then to let the local organizations sort of drive the agenda and the work and then pull in those experts as they need. And I just want to end by saying one other thing that kind of harkens back to kind of, some of the talking to young people about some of the problems that you face, right, that they face, that our country faces, that certain communities face more than others, are huge, and they're intersectional. And the pathway for change is not tomorrow. It's the next day and the next day and the next day. And, when I worked in gun violence, I had two sort of mantras that I would say. Is sometimes when it's so overwhelming, people turn away. And I said, well, don't turn away. Why don't you start with just turn towards someone who chooses hope, who chooses action, and just watch them. See what they're doing. See if you can support them. Turn towards those who are moving forward in this way. And I think the other thing is that in the face of the enormity of these problems is to not underestimate that anything you can contribute matters. And could be a seed that grows into a tree. You can have a conversation with somebody, right? And this is why I think it's so important to bring people together. That 10 years later, the meaning of that conversation comes into fruition, and it results in a personal change or something bigger, like a systemic change. And so just like I think the story of Mikva's origins or Common Cause, which isn't as dramatic, but you take an idea and you just start. You don't have to finish it.
Yeah.
Start. And then let the universe teach you some lessons about how to keep moving forward.
If I can piggyback off of that, because I think it kind of speaks to the Mikva statement a little bit too. So like what you talk about as far as organizing and activating young people is really like started from the empathy building that I would call it social emotional learning. It's one of like our buzzwords nowadays in like nonprofits and in the educational space, social emotional learning. And one thing as I interact with the young people, as I'm building my agendas, my curriculums and things like that, is that I'm always considering the impact that I want to have on the young people. How do I want them to feel? You know what I'm saying? Because that's really what I think the activation lies, and I'm spitballing a little bit here, but I think that's truly where the activation lies, in that empathy building. Because once, like I said, that whole Ubuntu, once they see that shared sort of mirror mentality, you know what I'm saying, we're all interconnected, they move differently. They feel like they feel a sense of urgency. Although like to call them like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, like although that's miles away, you know what I'm saying, they still feel affected by it because we have staff who are, affected by it, seeing it on their social media. And we have students whose family members are, associated with it and things like that. So like, as I'm building out my activities, I always frame up the activities and how I want them to feel, and empathy building. As I bring them to the table with different partners like Mary and Common Cause, I'm always starting with empathy. You know what I'm saying? What do you want to know? How can we build that authentic relationship and connection to the point where like, okay, this might not come in handy right now, but again, that check is going to cash in, let's say, 10 years, because change is a constant process. I tell them, like, it's not going to happen overnight. We're still building the plane. We're still constructing the plane, reimagining the plane as we're flying it. So, like, don't get weak or weary, you know what I'm saying, calling on, like, some nonviolence principle. Don't get weary by the fight, because the fight is still going to benefit, future generations, your kids, yourselves, and all of that sorts of things. So that's where, like, Mikva kind of, like, truly like has even empowered me to be more civically involved, take elections more seriously, me wanting to give back to my community on like a real fundamental level by just showing up. And that's really all it takes for young people, I think, is just showing up for them and building that trust and that empathy with them, because that belief can go so far, and you never know how that little mustard seed can kind of translate, like you said, to a complete forest, because that one person can impact other people. And that's when I think that our organizing power truly comes. I wouldn't have had this opportunity had Mary not floated, the idea, and that's like truly a blessing. That's the power of organizing, the ripple effects. How me and you are connected, Joe, through the university, how me and you are connected now, Magda, from doing this podcast. Like the ripples, the waves are going to continue to grow, and that's really where we're at with it. And yeah,
I love that. I just want to hop on one other thing you said about the feeling, and I say this a lot, but you say empathy. I say it's ultimately down to love, because we only fight for what we love. When we love something, we fight for it, right? And so that intrinsic, that resilience, that grit, that persistence, right, has to come from some place that doesn't just exist in your mind. And there's a lot of ways to build empathy or to well, I use love in quotations, right? And I think in some communities where they don't feel loved, they don't feel loved by the city, they don't feel loved by their school, they don't feel loved by the society or the police or all sorts of things. It's like that matters. And so to be able to build that, to nurture that, and to let it first come to them before they can go out to others.
Hurt people. That cliche is always happening. And then actually when I went to an event, like I said last week at Build with Lieutenant Governor Giurcanu strategy, she said like heal people. You know what I'm saying? So like as we work on our own, processes, our own hurts and things like that, that's a part of healing, our own healing journey. And through that healing journey, we can have those courageous conversations to heal others.
It's a nice transition to our next question, which is, give us an example of a project that you worked on and that was truly successful and you achieved everything that you wanted to achieve. And then maybe a project where could have gone in a different way, but for whatever reasons didn't go the right way. So what was success to you and perhaps not successful, again, based on how you understand your project?
Well, I mean, these are two, very different sort of projects, but a successful campaign, I'll call it a common cause, that happened right as I was coming. It happened before I got there, but it's something that we keep working to perfect, was automatic voter registration, okay? And, if you look at Illinois with all of our challenges, we have pretty solid voter rights compared to other states about how you can register, where you can register, how you can vote, how you can purge a person's name off the vote. And voter registration was so important, automatic, because people have competing demands, especially people who might be holding down job with inflexible work hours or multiple jobs or have to pick up kids or have transportation issues. Like, to make registering to vote as easy as possible is huge impact on our democracy and who can participate. Of course, that involved a coalition of organizations coming together. It involved activating those coalitions' constituents. It involved lobbying individual legislators. And then once you get it, then you have to implement it. And that's a whole other story, because you have to implement it in a way that fits with the existing infrastructure, the bureaucracies of our state. And so it's an ongoing process. But that was a victory where we feel that Illinois was a leader in that. I'm going to jump to a very, very different kind of project. We might talk about this more later, but one of the things Common Cause is trying to do, and part of the reason Ryan and I have connected, is engaging young people more and trying to find a way to have a conversation and to get their insights and engagement, but starting at a level where they're at, which may be disenfranchised from the system, not actively participating. Because why are you going to have the people who are participating? You want to go to the people who you want to activate. And so one of the things that we're worried about looking at the 2024 election is voter intimidation, mis and disinformation, potential violence, right? It's a hard thing to talk about. And some of these things happen in certain ways outside of Chicago, right? But a different kind of disenfranchisement happens in Chicago that we want to get young people's opinions on. And so we collaborated with Build, which is, Ryan's talked about a few times. It's in Austin, and it's a gang intervention youth development organization, which is amazing. I encourage everybody to check them out. And I asked them if they could put together two youth groups, and one was a female group and one was a male group, and they were emerging leaders who were going to be civic leaders in their communities. And it was really striking, because the young women, who I think had been involved longer than the young men, man, they were like, if somebody tries to mess with my vote, they're going to have to mess with me. If I meet somebody who says to me, I don't care about voting, well, I'm not talking to you. They valued their vote. They valued the power. They valued the right they had. And they felt that they were going to protect it no matter what. When we talked to the young men, and granted they'd been in the program as long, but it was like the polar opposite. It was, part of that is being a young teenage guy and, kind of wrapping your arms and you're too cool for school. Yeah, but a lot of these kids, they had been reading the news. I mean, they were well informed, and it was like, doesn't matter, I don't care, doesn't matter. And two things, sort of, we had a summer intern with us, and she's trying desperately to get something, then it doesn't matter. And then I told a story that when I was volunteering for the Obama campaign in 2008, I went and I knocked on doors in Gary, Indiana. And all these other people came and knocked on doors in Gary, Indiana, which is suffering in so many ways. And that election, they had a 93% voter turnout rate. And that is a very big reason why we elected the first black president of the United States of America, because of Gary, Indiana, putting that state over the top. And I said this, and they're like, kind of deep. And then about 10 minutes later, the quietest guy in the room said, "Excuse me," first time he spoke. He said, "Has anything changed since then, since Obama won? And for Gary, Indiana?" The answer is what?
The answer is no.
The answer is no. And so I sat there, and I mean, that felt like a failure, right? That felt like I'm trying to, gauge and have people sort of care. And then the only thing I could think of to say in response, besides that's true, and these and some of the people who were helping to co-facilitate talked about local and sort of building from the local, your backyard, and moving up. I said, the one thing I want you all to think about is, if your vote doesn't matter, why are so many people in this country trying to take it away? If it doesn't matter, why do people want to take it away? And I left them with that to think about. But that is a challenge, and I'd love to hear. I mean, you have to tell you, but like how we talk to young people about that, where they see, you lose issues, change is hard, like the stuff we were talking about before. That's hard, and so in a way, it's a failure, but it's also an opportunity to grow and keep learning and keep finding ways to address those very, very real feelings and perceptions of futility that we have.
Well, one thing that you really resonated with me was, like you said, the young man mentioned what's changed in Gary, Indiana. And I had the same sort of epiphany the other day. I was going to answer the question a little bit, but it was man, we are failing our young people. And I bring that up because we could go from today. We had the privilege of our funders at Mikva Challenge, of our donors and board members, the luxury of having a dinner with County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. Mm-hmm. That's our main stakeholder within the Safety and Justice Council. So we pretty much present recommendations, youth-centered recommendations to Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle every year, pretty much every summer. That's our think tank summer. And so we had the privilege of actually going to dinner, a fancy restaurant dinner downtown with the Cook County Board President, and to kind of to prep the young people to get ready for the meeting. I was trying to think about how I wanted them to feel, you know what I'm saying, and I landed on okay, what does dinner look like at your house, question mark? What does a successful dinner look like with your family, question mark? I really couldn't even formulate the question to the point, because I had to check my own self about what does a dinner look like to me? A successful dinner look like to me? How often have I had dinner with my own family? How often do I have dinner with my family? Period. What does a dinner look like? Is it always going to be this sort of separation, or I had to really think about that. Okay, that's something that let's say that my predecessors, my ancestors failed in, because something like that, I wasn't able to decompress my day. Think about how nice it is to come home to a home cooked meal and be like, yeah, Mom, I had a great day at school. What did you learn today? I try to implement that with my daughter now. What did you learn today? Can I help you? Those sorts of conversations. And when I ask my young people that, I don't have dinner with my family, question mark. I might have dinner with my brother. I might warm up some with my brother and things like that. And it really, like I said, reset my thinking into wow, this is truly a problem, to the point where our young people don't see themselves at Gibson Steakhouse having a fancy dinner. They can't see themselves at the same place as another public official, and what that could look like. So I really had to start from the bottom. So I wouldn't say that was a challenge, because again, that would be my highlight. Last week, again, we had the best dinner with County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. We presented recommendations, but most importantly, we had that story exchange, because we wanted to ground it in relationship building. A lot of my young people had never experienced a public official. That was their first time. As we reflected in debrief the day after, they said, wow, that was my first time shaking elected officials' hand. And that moment right there is truly transformative for them, because now that motivation is back up to do the work, to talk about topics within the juvenile detention center, which is what our recommendations center around. You said advocating for young people who are impacted and things like that. So like I said, that would be my highlight, but the best part about the highlight, from those sorts of impressions and those sorts of opportunities of them just being in the space, having the opportunity to be in the space, guess who was next door, literally right outside of our room? The Governor J.B. Pritzker. You understand, having a party, you know, what I don't know what they were doing, but he was right outside our door. Tony Preckwinkle looks up and says, yeah, do you guys want J.B. to come in here and introduce yourself to the council? Heck yeah. And they had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to not only have dinner at Gibson Steakhouse, which all of them never had before. You know, when I talked to them, they got to meet Cook County Board President, and they got to meet the governor of the state of Illinois. You know what I'm saying? We were only supposed to have the president for 15 minutes. We ended up keeping her for an hour and then getting a bonus, you know, with meeting the governor. So like, those sorts of moments are like truly powerful, and like really, like I said, that's the action civics of it, putting them at the table, having elected officials and civic partners listen to them and things like that. But yeah, that's pretty much my challenge and my highlight. And we also, I think of another highlight that I really wanted to mention was on like a community safety level. A couple of years back, or a year or so ago, we did something, the Safety and Justice Council did something called Community Safety and Justice University. And it was pretty much during COVID, we pretty much did different virtual meetings, like 3 sequential meetings from Tuesday, Wednesday to Thursday, covering different topics on policing. So like, one of the main ones that really stuck out and like really resonated with the young people was the Know Your Rights workshop. And that pretty much detailed what to do, what young people could do, or what just general civilians could do if in the event of police encounter. So like stopping frisk, getting pulled over, literally equipping them with their constitutional rights, the knowledge, the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment, and knowing what to do. Like, that even empowered me to like I'm gonna say it on record, but like, I haven't gotten a ticket, you know what I'm saying, because I know how to navigate those encounters and things like that. I know my rights. I know, you know, what to say, what to show, what to consent to, what not to consent to, and that really activated our young people, but also put them in the driver's seat, literally and figuratively, to advocate for their communities, but also disperse the information to their community, because that's what I think is the last step. Like, okay, I've learned this information, now you take that to somebody else to teach them as well. And that's where I think the power comes from, at least from the Black community, because again, if I have this knowledge, I can equip somebody else, iron sharpens iron, and I could possibly save our lives, save a Black person's life, a person of color's life, because that's what really it boils down to sometimes in our situation. So like, for me, that was like my main highlight, you know, especially coming from Roseland, a place that is like over policed and, you know, constantly in the news and things like that for gun violence, but like always being grounded in, like I said, equipping young people and people in general with their rights and things like that, and being, like you said, definitely constitutionally bound and civically engaged.
Yeah, and seeing those leaders, that relationship, they become humanized. They're not some mystical,
right, exactly,
sort of, you know, they're flesh and bone, just like we all are.
Those workshops, you know, can go either way. Like you said, since Mikva is also a nonpartisan organization. Yeah, strike that. No, look, nonpartisan organization. Like, we had to have those sort of reckonings with the Chicago Police Department, because we did have officers come in to talk to young people, and we had to, you know, sort through a lot of that trauma, some of those historical traumas that young people have experienced, some of the ostracized and some of the stuff that they've seen in school, for instance, like from, you know, security guards and things like that. We had to unpack all of that and start from the ground in order to get young people to even want to engage. Like, I even take the young people to visit the CPD headquarters on 35th in Michigan, and, you know, it's like a real moment for them, you know what I'm saying, to see like how the headquarters functions, but also being in a space where, you know, although it's their job, having guns, you know, things like that on their person, although it's a part of their uniform, but like them feeling threatened by young people, the young people feel like they give off the impression that they're, you know, threatening the officers just by being in the space, because it is a part of their uniform. So like, having those sorts of conversations about like being youth friendly, you know what I'm saying, like unpacking that, like bringing yourself down, you know, taking out some of those barriers and things like that for engagement.
I just want to say, I think what you just talked about really articulates and demonstrates how important it is to understand where people are coming from. You know, people have then we talk about like lived experience, because it's different, right? And so the idea that there's one way to do civic engagement, like, no, right? Because we all have different experiences, things we take for granted. And I think I might have mentioned this to you, or maybe it was you, Joe, about like I had this idea once. I was in a room with some young people. It was like a workshop, and they were using all these words that I knew what they meant because I worked in youth development, but they weren't the kind of words that I grew up with. And they were words about OG, LG, you know, the guy who stands on the corner and looks for the cop, and all this sort of lexicon about what was happening in that community just to walk 2 blocks to that school. And then I thought, what would you do if you went over to New Trier in the North Shore? And they talked about percentiles and and they talked about some different words and like how you could have these word clouds. Eskimos, or they had like 500 words for snowflake because there's so many different kinds of snowflakes, right? Language reflects reality. And how interesting it would be to take, you know, 2 groups of young people who maybe live 10 miles apart, but see the difference of their lexicons and what that meant about their lived experience, their sense of where they belonged, what their future was, and just sort of unpack that. It's, you know, I remember in Roseland, I worked with Diane Latiker from Kids Off the Block, and you know, she would arrange for these basketball games. And a lot of people, like, she's just doing a basketball game. You know, what does that mean? Whoopie-doo. Well, it's like, no, she's getting young people who might shoot each other in a different circumstance to come on her block, respect her space, and play against the same people that they might have a beef with off the court. And then what does that do? Right? It plants the seed of relationship.
Conflict resolution.
Right, and conflict resolution. And so where you live or what your experience is, you may not understand just how valuable somebody who every summer puts together a basketball league in that neighborhood, right? And, you know, whereas another person might just send their kid to camp and doesn't matter. So all these things mean different things depending on where you are and who you are, right? So I think that's really important when we think about engagement and having humility to understand, then learn and listen. And not just listen to words, but listen to the feeling behind the words in order to understand how to engage.
Okay, so as a person who got an English degree, like the lexicon got my brain working a little bit. So I would say the last part of my job is, like I said, stakeholder engagement and creating policy recommendations, like I've already like kind of alluded to, and things like that. So with that being said, I would say that's a different game, teaching young people how to write, and not teaching them, but like supporting them in their writing process. The place that I start really is that language determines our reality. So like as a person who got my English degree, I'm always like triggered by like root words, where words come from and things like that. But like how we have to unlearn certain words and how we describe things. That's what dictates the meaning and how we perceive things. So like words like justice impacted, juvenile, for instance, is really how the council started, the Juvenile Justice Council. But like that word has like some negative connotations. It's nothing really rehabilitative about it. You know what I'm saying? It's more consequential. When I think of juvenile, I think of juvie. I think of the audio home. I think of all of these sorts of like negative stereotypes that come with this, like a young person who has done bad. You know what I'm saying? As opposed to like how I now, you know, address young people who have been justice impacted, justice involved. You know what I'm saying? Because again, that's really what it's the justice system. It's not juvenile. They're not juvenile. Juvenile is more of like an age thing. You know what I'm saying? Then even when I think of like, as I've like, you know, heard from different researchers and things like that, like young people aren't even mature until like 25 years old. You know, their brain, you know, the reasoning isn't all the way there, especially when we talk about like conflict resolution and things like that. So like my young people, I always try to get them like to deconstruct like some of the words that they think about and how we address each other. Like that's why it always starts around, like you said, that social, emotional, and relationship authenticity and humility. Like I said, showing up, you know, truly vulnerable. When I show up vulnerable in the space, that, you know, kind of like I said, makes them want to show up vulnerable because they see me and I see them in that same sort of way. So I couldn't let that moment pass, especially when we, like I said, talking about words, because I myself have to do so much unlearning, you know what I'm saying, especially in terms of like I said, the justice system and how we talk about people who simply just made mistakes. And that's pretty much where I'm at with it, especially as I work with like justice impacted young people who've had their parents involved in the justice system, young people who still have their parents in the justice system, whether that be on, electronic monitoring and all this sorts of stuff. All of this stuff comes up during session, which is like crazy, you know what I'm saying? Because we're just talking about topics of gun violence, if you will, and public safety, but like they end up sharing these deep sort of things to the point where like I have to have sort of a holistic wraparound approach, and I become sort of a therapist in a way. And like, no offense, I'm not equipped to handle that. So that's when I say like, we are failing our young people in that sort of way to make sure that their mental capacity is taken care of. That way they can progress and produce in a more like, beneficial way to themselves and our communities.
I really enjoy that language metaphor that you guys have been toying with. And I think it illuminates how disconnected young people might feel because we don't have a shared language when it comes to civic fluency. In my mind, restorative justice is a great way to create a shared language or co-create it with young people. But in your experience, what have been the best practices to get disaffected, disenfranchised, disengaged young people more interested in participating?
And at the same time, what are the main issues that young people care deeply about based on your personal observations?
I'll answer the latter question first. I think that young people, and this is me speaking as not as a young person, I think that at least the young people that I work with, they care deeply about like having a voice and representation for issues that affect them mostly. Like, so one thing that we've been talking really deep about is conversation about youth trends. And as we talk about youth language, a youth trend is basically what we see on social media happening downtown Chicago when young people show up in mass to like, let's say Millennium Park across the street, and they come kick it and they do things or whatever. I would never go. But a lot of the young people I talk to in my council say the same thing. They would never go because it isn't their type of crowd. But like, they actively care about solutions of how we can minimize some of the violence and damage that is done during the trend. They don't have a problem with going to the trend. It's just a matter of the violence and the stipulations that come with being at the trend. So the stigma is like, okay, yeah, we're gonna destroy property. Oh yeah, there might be a fight. There might be guns and violence and things like that. So our young people really care about creating spaces, accessible public spaces for them to kick it at. They really realize, like, as we did our research, there really isn't youth-friendly, youth-centered spaces around downtown. Like, I recall back in my day, quote unquote, like I used to be able to go to the mall and go to the movie, but nowadays malls are dead. For lack of a better phrase, like, come downtown and kick it with my friends and go to the Icon Theater on Roosevelt and have a good time. But nowadays, like, I don't really have that option because it might not be safe, even though it is downtown. Some of the safest parts of downtown. So our young people actively care about like having like access to public spaces and things like that. And then on top of that is having that representation on different commissions and boards and things like that. That way they don't have this problem again where people are making decisions without them being involved. And I think that my young people are very good at like researching and delegating, to the point where they can stand up for their own selves and advocate for themselves. When you give young people the agency to decide, they'll surprise you. It's really where I'm at with it. So I think, like I said, some of the challenges are pretty much just having accessible, welcoming spaces that even incentivize them coming. Like, I remember at the end of the summer or during the summer, one of the organizations, I can't remember if it was My Block, My Hood, My City, who gave young people like $100 card or something like that to come downtown one weekend and pretty much spend the money on kicking it downtown, that type of vibe. And, just having the same sort of access to the city that tourists have. So the same sort of access to the city that, the people with money have. Like, we should be able to experience the city, that we live in, that we grew up in the same sort of, fantastic fashion. I'm 32 years old again. I still have yet to see the city, in that sort of way. Like, so I want my young people to experience it way faster than I would. And that's pretty much what they want to see too. They just want to be included.
How do you? I mean, you do this work deeply and all the time. I mean, I think of a few things in listening to what you were saying, Ryan. And one is I just know as a young person that when an adult talked to me like I was a human being, like a full person, that mattered a lot. That I had something to offer. And I think so many ways that we talk about young people is we are going to help them, we are going to fix them, we are going to do all these things to them. It's one of the things that drives me crazy in the nonprofit space is, like changing kids to have productive futures. So one is really sort of authentically recognizing that we need them. And I feel that, just as a human being, but in my role at Common Cause, it's not like, okay, the right thing to do is to, work with young people. No, we need young people to tell us what to do, how to do it, what matters. We need to build a pipeline to future leaders. We need to infuse our priorities with the people who will be living with what we accomplish for years afterwards. And so I don't think this relationship, it's not linear, it's a circle where I think we have to be in constant engagement where there's a mutuality. It's bilateral, it's not a unilateral thing. I think also though, and to get from this sort of divine, the circle, the sun, the nature. Also, let's get real about Chicago. Chicago's the most segregated city in the frickin' country. And I was blessed to grow up. It was in the crazy time, New York in the 70s. I was born in 64, latchkey kid, crazy time. But I could never step outside my door and not know there were 100 different people who weren't like me. And what I think is so tragic in Chicago with the segregation, it's not just segregation where people live, it's where they go to school, it's where all that. When you're talking about young people coming downtown and not feeling welcome and people seeing them downtown and not wanting them there and all this, we talked about language and not understanding each other's words. I think it's almost like that basketball thing where it's much more than a game. When I worked in Austin at Build, this kid was going to Columbia College for a college interview. He lived in Austin, and he was taking the L for the first time downtown. And they wrote about it in the Austin Daily or whatever the paper is out there. And it was like Malcolm X's pilgrimage to Mecca. It was, because he saw different people. He saw white people and Mexican people and people he didn't know what they were, and he was in the same car with them. And I'm like, this kid was 17, 18, and he had never had that experience before. So I think particularly Chicago, like you were talking about with the Gibson Steakhouse, right, is creating experiences that may not be directly related to changing the world or to lobbying your legislator or to voting, but is to create these pathways of experience where we start to see a world that's bigger than right here in front of us. And that it's not just something we read about, it's something that we experience as a human being. And I think, it's about bringing all of that together. And I think, again, particularly in Chicago, we've got even more work to do with that.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because when I think about one of my young people, he came from the west side, I believe Austin or North Mondale, one of those, but he's a west sider through and through, and he was justice impacted, and I got him, you know what I'm saying? I would call him rough around, he would call himself a little rough around the edges a little bit, but when I say that, him sticking around Mikva Challenge for a couple years, we were blessed again to have the opportunity to take young people to Washington, D.C., to, pretty much see how to lobby Congress, essentially. So we went to D.C., went to the different offices of senators and U.S. representatives, and I got a picture of him on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's one of the rawest IG pictures ever. He's a rapper and everything, and he posted it, on his page, yeah, this is me at the Supreme Court, of the United States versus at Cook County where I was a year or so ago. You know what I'm saying? And that moment for me, bro, I would call it real thug tears to my eyes, because it's
Thug tears.
Man, man, bro, that's another black man whose trajectory is pretty much changed. His life is forever changed from that sort of experience. He sees himself there. He not only sees himself there, he's been there. He's been there. He can tell other people, I've been there. You can get there too. You know what I'm saying? That's literally where I'm at as far as restorative justice. That's the restorative part of it. That's the building of it. Seeing themselves there, them telling somebody else, that harm that was at Cook County before at the heads of the justice system, now you see yourselves in a different position. Now you see yourself lobbying. You see yourself on the steps of the Capitol. You know what I'm saying? Advocate for change, that people look like you, you know, that type of thing. And like I said, that was just a really beautiful moment for me to like have with him and his natural lexicon. You know, it's just him being grateful. Like, man, Ryan, that's so real. I ain't never thought I ain't never did this before. It's really how he came to me. And his name, I'm gonna say it, his name is Jesus. Like, the irony of it, his name is Jesus. Like, and he just, you know, like that power of a name and how we like name things, like having him like see his purpose is really what it was. Like, reevaluate his purpose and his message, like him as a rapper, how he can put that into his music and influence the next generation of his peers. Like, I've seen him rap and like show up at the conference like in front of his peers where he never would have talked to before outside on the street because they would have been scared to approach him. You know what I'm saying? So like those moments for me are truly the restoration, the rehabilitation of it. I know for a fact I won't see Jesus out here, you know what I'm saying, doing something. He might be kicking it with his homies, but I know he gonna be the one telling them like, yeah, bro, there's something better for us out here. You know what I'm saying? We could do something different. Not even better, we could do something different. And I got him right now recruiting, you know, somebody else, you know, in his similar position who he thinks can, you know, take on the mantle that he left. You know what I'm saying? Because again, the work continues. That's what I told him. Like, yeah, you know, you might have aged out, you might be 19, but the work continues. You know, you gotta leave a legacy, and that's really what I'm instilling in young people. Like, this council is a legacy of young people who advocate for people who are impacted. We have to continue that legacy. That is our purpose. That is our buy-in. That's the restoration of it. That's how we build those principles. We continue that legacy that the people left before us.
Well, thank you both. I think it was great. I think we really learned a lot, and I mean, you gave us so many ideas to think about and how to perhaps implement some of the advice that you have for us as educators.
You all gifted us such a valuable first podcast, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening. This is the Growing Democracy team at National Youth University. Stay tuned for more episodes.